Good day, and today we're going to look at an introduction to Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. We'll start with the author, Emily Bronte. She was born in northern England in 1818. She grew up near the Yorkshire moors, one of 6 children. Now, Emily was a daughter of a reverend and his wife, and her mother died when she was 3. Now, Emily was a bit reclusive. She had few friends outside of the family, but she was exposed to a microcosm of society through her father's congregation. Now, Emily never had a career or married, and she rarely left her home. Now, people in her hometown of Haworth, Yorkshire, were characterized as being blunt and passionate and using colorful speech. Much of this language is reflected in Wuthering Heights. Modern critics place Bronte among the best of Victorian writers, and while her sister Charlotte was more popular during the time period in which they lived, Emily is now looked at as the more talented of the two. Now, Emily's sisters were Charlotte and Anne Bronte. The 3 sisters published poems under the pseudonyms of Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell. We also see Emily publishing first with Wuthering Heights in 1846. Charlotte comes along in 1847 with Jane Eyre, and Anne wrote Agnes Grey in the same year. Emily Bronte tended to her brother Branwell, who was dying from alcoholism and drug abuse, and she caught a severe cold at his funeral, which developed into tuberculosis. She died shortly after him in 1848. Now, we are in Yorkshire, England for reality, but also Wuthering Heights is set there as well. In fact, it's set in 3 locations, not just the Yorkshire moors, but we also have 2 homes called Wuthering Heights and Thrush Grange. So if we're looking at a map of this fictitious place, it looks quite a bit like the hometown that Emily herself would grow up in. So if we look at Thrush Grange, it is the more glamorous of the 2 homes. You can see that it is quite big. It's got this huge court with the stables, which are very close to the road. We also have a garden-tended area, and then, of course, the main entrance that leads to the kitchen on one side, the parlor, the library, the drawing room, and the bedrooms on the other side. Now, Bronte emphasizes the relationship of each house to the natural world around it. For example, Wuthering Heights is located on top of a hill, where it's exposed to the harsh weather and is dark and gloomy. Thrush Grange, on the other hand, is located in a valley where it's protected by a stone wall. The Grange is also luxuriously decorated. Now, there's contrasting houses that also directly reflect the inhabitants who live inside. The Earnshaws live at Wuthering Heights, the dark and gloomy place, and the Lintons live at Thrush Cross, which is in that valley that is unexposed. Now, the word wuthering means stormy or turbulent and wild. And the moor is an essentially hostile environment, but it's also characterized as beautiful. You have these rugged hills with scattered, hard black stones and very little vegetation. It's a very desolate and isolated part in England. And the setting of Wuthering Heights reflects this area where Emily Bronte grew up, the Yorkshire moors. Now, if we look at the historical background of the time period that Emily Bronte is writing in, the Victorian age refers to the period in England when Queen Victoria reigned, approximately 1837 to 1901. The British Empire had reached its height and ruled approximately 1/4 of the world. During this time, the Industrial Revolution also created profound economical changes in society. England then also changed from a primarily agricultural country to an industrial one, which created a great social upheaval within its own country. While wealth had traditionally been measured by land ownership, the 18th century had begun a trend towards a cash-based economy, creating a middle class who were more economically powerful than its land-owning superiors, known as the gentry. The power of the yeoman, or the respectable farming class, as well as the traditional power-holding gentry, was challenged by the newly wealthy capitalists. Now, Wuthering Heights was written in 1847, a time when capitalism and industrial revolution were dominant forces of the British economy and society. It was a time of rapid and often confusing change that led to violence. As a result of the change in economy, the traditional relationships between classes and the social structure began to change. New class distinctions emerged from the growth of industrial production. A new middle class began to emerge. Each of the classes is also represented in the novel. For example, the upper class and the gentry in this particular novel is shown by the landowners and the farming class. The middle class would be the shopkeepers and the merchants, and the lower class or the poor would be the factory workers or the unemployed. During this time period in England, women's rights were also changing. Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights during the beginning of the women's rights movement in England. And the primary concerns of the movement were the lack of women's right to vote and the lack of married women's property rights. The latter issue arises in Wuthering Heights. When we look at literary historical periods, we also can see that this novel is written not only in the Romantic movement, but we might also call it the Gothic movement. This novel depicts the dark side of human nature through violence and obsessive love. Now, this novel deviates from the norm of the Victorian period and includes a sinister realism and dark overtones. Now, in the July 1848 issue of Graham's magazine, the novel was described as portraying, quote, vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors. In fact, this novel was met with much criticism when first published. Characters were classless in Wuthering Heights, rough in nature and angry. However, the characters are true to life, and Bronte's portrayal of the time period and laws are accurate. Yet we are still bound to the Romantic novel. Some of the elements of Romantic novel include nature as a powerful spiritual force. We have these beautiful descriptions of the countryside in Wuthering Heights. The characters also will exhibit elevated emotional levels of passion. There's also a desire to rise above the limitations of ordinary human existence, and there's a very strong interest in death. Again, these are usually seen as Gothic elements, but Gothicism is kind of underneath the umbrella of Romanticism. There's also a portrayal of opposites, the idea of escape and at the same time pursuit, the ideas of opposites of life and death. Now, this is based in the Yorkshire moors, so there's going to be a sense of isolation, not only just geographical, but also emotional. And of course, there will be elements of the supernatural bringing in that Gothic element. Continuing on with elements of a Gothic novel, we have these sinister ruined buildings that could be possibly haunted. We have this extreme landscape in the Yorkshire moors. The weather is going to be terrible. There's these bad omens and ancestral curses that people will discuss. There's going to be death, and there's going to be people who go crazy. They have this sense of madness. There might also be taboo and sensational topics, and again, that for that time period. I mean, a taboo or a sensational topic of the time period would be about a married woman wanting a property right. There's always a hint or a suggestion of the supernatural, and there's always going to be a villain or a Byronic hero, the villain hero that is driven by passion. There has to be that heroine that is wooed by both a good and a dangerous suitor, and a very classic element of Gothic revenge. So let's look at the idea of a Byronic hero, because Heathcliff is a very classic Byronic hero. This is defined by Lord Byron's epic narrative poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage in 1812. Some of the elements of the Byronic hero include a distaste for social institutions and social norms, conflicting emotions or moodiness, high levels of intelligence and cunning, and at the same time, they turn it on themselves as self-criticism. They usually also have a troubled past that comes out piece by piece, or at least mysterious origins that you won't find out about until later. They have a tendency towards being self-destructive, and a lot of times they've already been rejected from society. They are a loner. Now let's take a look very briefly at the themes for Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. First of all, what is spiritual love versus superficial love? The idea of just lusting versus the actual idea of a true romantic love. You also have the theme of constraint versus freedom, where we feel this sense of isolation or this feeling of being trapped versus this sense of freedom geographically and freedom emotionally. The theme of revenge and retribution for past sins and past doings will definitely be prevalent throughout the generations in Wuthering Heights. There will also be the destructiveness of a possessive love and the precariousness of social class. The social class standing becomes very important in this book, especially when it comes to who can love whom. You also have this temporary impermanence of self and the permanence, or having something very lasting, of something larger than self. So we're looking at this, how you yourself are very temporary and not lasting. But something larger than yourself is going to be extremely important. Now, Wuthering Heights is highly praised for the unique narrative technique Emily Bronte used to execute the novel, and it's often referred to as a frame narrative. Here, the two main narrators are Lockwood and Nellie Dean, who are workers at these two houses, but other narrators arise throughout the novel when Nellie quotes what other characters have told her. In other words, you don't quite know who is narrating, who is telling the story, and whether or not they have a sense of bias or they're unreliable. Now, the frame narrative form of the novel adds complexity for the reader. Lockwood is the outer layer. He's the guy who has come in after all of these generations. He is not related to anyone, and he's attempting to tell the story from a reliable standpoint. But he does not have all the information. Nellie, then, is the inner layer. She has watched all the people at these two homes grow up and become who they are. So she has some bias, but she also has the information to give to us. Since the story passes through layers, the reader must question the reliability of everything that he or she reads. For example, Nellie is going to gloss over events to minimize her own guilt in the story. And your friend Lockwood, who has not been in the story, he's just relating the story almost on a secondhand account. He's very naive. He lacks good judgment. He doesn't know which character we should be rooting for and which character is supposed to be the bad guy. He's just not involved in the story. Now, Wuthering Heights is also being told in Medius Res. It's in the middle of things because Lockwood has come in after a lot of the story has already been taken place. So he's giving you a lot of flashbacks, but the story is also not done at the time that Lockwood comes in. Now, in Medius Res usually describes a narrative that begins not at the beginning of the story, but somewhere in the middle, usually at a crucial point in action. This purpose in Wuthering Heights is to add a sense of mystery. Next, let's look at the characters. Mr. Lockwood is the first narrator of the story that before Nellie Dean takes over later. He's also Heathcliff's tenant at Thrushcross Grange. He's well educated, but he doesn't like to be around people, hence that's why he has come to the Yorkshire moors. Mrs. Ellen, or Nellie Dean, is the second narrator of the story. She once lived at Wuthering Heights, but then became housekeeper at Thrushcross Grange for the Earnshaws. She is sensible, and she's trusted by most characters in the story. All characters will confide in her. She's also referred to as Ellen Dean and grows up serving Catherine and later serves Heathcliff. Nellie will also narrate the past action of the story to Lockwood. Heathcliff, your Byronic hero, is brought to Wuthering Heights as a young boy by old Mr. Earnshaw. He has a wild, uncontrollable nature, and he's consumed by his love for Mr. Earnshaw's daughter, Catherine. Catherine Earnshaw is a wild girl growing up at Wuthering Heights. She will befriend Heathcliff as a child, and she's attracted to the refined life at Thrushcross Grange. Therefore, she is going to have this tie or be torn between two lovers. She recognizes that she loves Heathcliff, but she will marry Edgar Linton for the money. Edgar Linton is a pampered, somewhat spoiled boy living at Thrushcross Grange. He's polite and well-educated and attempts to civilize Catherine, but he does not understand her passionate personality. Now, Isabella Linton is the sister of Edgar Linton. She is also raised at Thrushcross Grange, just like Edgar, but she's shallow and weak. She later becomes abusive and vengeful after marrying Heathcliff. We also have Hindley Earnshaw, Catherine's brother. He despises Heathcliff for being favored by his father, Mr. Earnshaw, and he is unkind and self-destructive and mistreats and humiliates Heathcliff. You also have Joseph, an elderly servant at Wuthering Heights, who is prone to evangelical ravings about sin. He's a religious fanatic, and he speaks with a thick Yorkshire accent. You're also going to have a new generation growing up after the first generation of lovers. You have Hareton Earnshaw. He's the son of Hindley and Frances Earnshaw. He's used as a pawn by Heathcliff to wreak revenge on Hindley and grows up to be a big and strong man with a bad temper, kind of very much like Heathcliff himself. You have Cathy Linton, who's the daughter of Catherine Earnshaw and Edgar Linton. She has a sheltered upbringing at Thrushcross Grange and eventually brings peace and happiness to Wuthering Heights. She'll spend quite a bit of time with Linton Heathcliff, the sickly son of Isabella Linton and Heathcliff, who is self-centered and he's unable to love anyone. And finally, we'll look a little bit at the literary elements and techniques you will see in Wuthering Heights. The first half of the novel tells the story of Catherine Earnshaw, Heathcliff, and Edgar Linton. The second half mirrors the first by describing the actions of the children of these characters, such as Cathy Linton, Linton Heathcliff, and Hareton Earnshaw. Your big symbols of literary elements are the homes themselves, Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. They represent not just the geography of the place, but of the people living inside. Again, you're going to see a lot of Gothic elements coming through the story. Watch specifically for the use of ghosts when it comes to foreshadowing what you might learn next in the story. You should also read for the sense of gender, for rhetorical language, and the style of writing. And lastly, here is your family tree, because there are some people with very similar names, especially when some of the children take on the last names as first names. Watch where your family tree is going, especially since there's a lot of ties between these two family members when it comes to marriage and when it comes to loving one another. Thank you so much for stopping by for an introduction to Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. If you'd like me to go through a summary or maybe analyze some of the chapters of Wuthering Heights, leave a comment down below. Let me know if you'd like to see that. Or if you'd like me to see me cover other Brontes as well, leave a comment down below for that as well. And as always, take care.